Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Kathryn Nicolai is the owner of Ethos Yoga in Holly, Michigan. She's also the creator of the enormously successful podcast, Nothing Much Happens, and her book, Nothing Much Happens, was published in October 2020. Kathryn, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us again.
I'm so glad to be back, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted you back because I want to talk about this book titled Nothing Much Happens. Cozy and calming stories to soothe your mind and help you sleep, which is so vitally important for so many of us.
It is. It's based on my podcast, which has now over 30 million downloads and has hit the top of the charts in lots of countries all over the world. But it goes a bit deeper than the podcast. I found that a lot of people, for various reasons, maybe they didn't have a great relationship with technology, or they had too big of a relationship with technology and they didn't want their phone by their head at night, that they needed a different way to consume this content. And I also wanted to add some things to it. There's these really beautiful, very soothing illustrations by an artist named Léa Lepiver. And there are meditations and recipes and self-care practices that are all meant to sort of envelop the reader in this world where things are a little simpler and a little bit slower.
Well, and I think you've accomplished that beautifully. You know, I mentioned to you before we started recording that I really want to compliment you for choosing the illustrator and the illustrator for matching this content. You know, the soothing and calming that's in the stories is so beautifully matched with these illustrations.
That was really important to me. And I have a condition called aphantasia, which means that I am literally incapable of visualizing anything. I don't have an inner eye. So when I was first talking with the publisher about what it would look like, they said, "What do you imagine?" And I said, "Nothing."
Yeah, absolutely nothing.
But I can't imagine anything. But I had been sort of collecting a board online of various artists that I thought would be a good fit. And we started with about 25 artists between the ones I picked and the ones that Penguin picked. And right from the beginning, Léa was my favorite. And day by day, we'd cross off a few more people. And then at the end, they said, "Who is it?" And I said, "For me, it's Léa." And they said, "It's Léa for us too." And one thing that really resonated with me about her artwork is that it was already very inclusive. There were all kinds of people in the world that she drew. And that was really important to me because that's the world I write about. I always want people to see themselves in the story, to feel like it's about that they can imagine themselves in it. And so it was such a thrill to me to see the world that I've been writing about, because I could never see it without her.
Well, so what gave rise to the podcast, and what is it that takes you to storytelling?
I've always been a storyteller, and I've always been, somebody who I told myself bedtime stories as a very young child to fall asleep. It was a way to self-soothe. And I've always been totally entranced by, especially auditory story, like having someone tell a story. I remember the very first audio book, that was back when it was books on tape, that my dad checked out from the library for me when I was 8 years old. And he had to check it out every 2 weeks for 4 months because I wouldn't stop listening to it. I think partially because I don't have this visual element to my imagination, speech, hearing a story being told was really captivating to me. And that's probably why I started the podcast, as being able to use my own voice to reach out to people and tell a story.
How long have you been doing the podcast?
The podcast is coming up on its 3rd anniversary in just a couple more months.
And it's titled?
Nothing Much Happens.
Excellent. So I'm curious with the aphantasia description, what happens when you're hearing somebody tell a story or reading a story? Are you visualizing it?
No, I have
Are
no.
are you remembering? Do you remember your past events visually?
No, I have no visual capacity at all inside my mind. I can't imagine, for example, my face. If I close my eyes, I couldn't imagine my own face or anyone's face or any object at any time. Usually aphants will use the term conceptualize because imagination implies image.
Right.
There is a visual image. And for us, we are thinking our way through a set of facts or things that we understand. I can think, and I notice that in the description of the podcast, have always said, if you wake in the middle of the night, think your way through whatever you can remember from the story, because that's how I experience it. I imagine for people who visualize, they very might well see their way through. But for me, it's just about sort of understanding a series of bits of information.
Well, it's fascinating. I have had the thing, it's nothing like what you're talking about, but in a different way. It's very different from other people. If I'm out with somebody and we're thinking about opening a new office or putting in some furnishings or adding, if there's an old couch that needs to be replaced, and they'll say, how do you think this would look in there? Now, if we bring this thing into that room, I can tell you, yeah, I like it or I don't like it. But to visualize this thing fitting in that space or how it would look next to that, it just doesn't work. And that the kind of the ability to memorize and compare.
Yeah, that was kind of how I found out that first realized that I had aphantasia. Most people with aphantasia don't think that y'all are being literal when you say imagine or see it with your inner eye. We think that you're not literally meaning that you can see it. But we were renovating our house, and I remember my wife would ask me, what if the cabinet in the bathroom was black instead of white? And I would look at her like,
what do you mean? Yeah.
And she would say, you don't like
words
it. And I'd say, no, I have no idea. To me, it was like having a bag of marbles and going, what colors marble will I take out next? It's literally impossible for me to know unless you take it out and show it to me. So, but she's like a super visualizer, and she can easily figure out what goes where. And so that was when I first started to notice that my brain worked a little differently. And for aphants, often we do have problems with memory. There's an overlapping condition called severely deficient autobiographical memory that overlaps with aphantasia for a lot of people. And it does for me too. So that means that there's big chunks of my own life that I don't remember. But I find it kind of freeing. It keeps me very present. In some ways, I think the combination of those conditions make me the person to write this book, because I have what I have in front of me, which is the present moment. And that's what my book always celebrates.
Well, and it reminds me of what you highlighted here near the end of the book, where you said, thanks to Mary Oliver for all of her words, her poetry, her instructions. The instructions were, pay attention, be astonished, and write about it.
That's right. I feel like she's such the patron saint of mindfulness, of being able to stand in your own life and observe even the small, mundane details and be astonished by them. Find them captivating, find something to enjoy and be grateful for in the experience of them. You know, I often talk about in yoga, but it's true in my writing too, that our lives are made up mostly of very small moments. There might be some very big moments at the end of your life, a handful, the moment you fell in love, the day a baby was born, the day a dream came true. But most of our days are small moments. You're washing the dishes, you're taking the dog outside, you're getting into bed at night. They're small. But if those small moments can become more meaningful because you pay closer attention, then your whole life becomes more meaningful, has more value.
Yeah, I think it's David E. Martin who talks about how the vast majority of moments in our lives are monotonously good and safe.
That's a really nice way to say it.
And so he's talking about it in terms of the way people catastrophize and spin off and what if, and they build all this worry about the future. And he's saying, you know, like, you don't have to have a lot of faith and hope and things like that, you can go on the fact that the vast majority of moments in our lives, the car didn't blow up, the avalanche didn't sweep us away, etc. And so it's monotonously good and safe. Mm-hmm. And if we can learn to just be aware of that, that's the mindfulness thing, right? Be here in this present moment. And I do have enough in this moment. I have enough heartbeat. I have enough breath. I have enough physical comfort to survive. And in a way, I think that's part of what you're doing in these stories is bringing us into these moments.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, I mean, I don't want to turn over to the Kindle and flip back to the forward, but talk about how you introduce why you're doing this and what you hope the stories will provide for people.
Right. I opened the book just kind of explaining that if you feel anxious, if you are sleepless, you are not alone. But we can learn better habits around sleep hygiene. There's hope. And there's these really ancient techniques. I say that storytelling is old magic, and sleeping now is a modern superpower. And I do think there's a reason why so many cultures have used storytelling in a myriad of ways over history, but it's a way that people connect to each other. It's a way for people to understand things, to know what to pay attention to heal from past wounds. So I don't take storytelling lightly, even though my stories aren't about much. And so I kind of explained to my readers at the beginning of the book that it's a really simple technique. You allow yourself as you read to soak up as much detail as you can, because the stories are really rich in sensory details. I like to lean into how things smell or sound or taste or feel. And that because there's not dramatic action, you get to just sort of lounge around in the mood that each story creates. And once you read a story or two, you close the book, you turn the light off, and then you take your mind and rest it in that place you just created. It's a familiar, maybe even slightly nostalgic place that's very safe. It's rich in detail. And what that does is it moves people off of the default mode network of the brain, that background static that can eat away at us, especially if you wake up at like 3 o'clock in the morning and you feel the wheel starting to turn. That's the default mode network. And in order to go to sleep, we've got to get out of default mode. And the best way to do that is what they call the task positive network. Basically, your brain needs a job to do. And the job that we give it with my stories is basically just to think your way through the process of being in this place, of smelling this thing, of hearing this sound. And people tell me from all over the world, I never thought it would work, but it worked like that.
Wonderful. And I've, experienced it for myself. I've often gotten myself into that. You mentioned sleep hygiene, and some people may not have heard that term, but it's just paying attention to all the aspects of the environment around which or in which I hope to fall asleep. So it's the preparation, it's the sound, it's the light, it's, food or no food, it's the comfort of, and these days, a lot of people are finding out the benefits of weighted blankets. Mm-hmm. And so it's all these things that might contribute to me creating an environment that facilitates me sleeping.
Yeah.
And so I've enjoyed the idea of the mellow music, the soothing music, sometimes, the instrumental, whether it's classical or another type. And I find your stories do much the same thing. And I've even done them in combination. So I've got the light music going in the background and reading the story from your book. And
yeah, I mean, that's setting yourself up for the right kind of experience, right? It can even be something like, I find that I sleep better if I make my bed. Something about coming into my bedroom and seeing that my bed's been made. It gives me a feeling of order and being taken care of. And I sleep better in a bed that's made. Also knowing that I need to have a time limit for when I stop looking at screens. Things like that, they just remind me that my own sleep is important. It's a way to care for myself. It doesn't, and it can be really pleasurable. That's what I think often the component that I find missing for folks when they want to do something like mindfulness or meditation is that these are very important kinds of internal work, but sometimes they can be quite difficult. And if you're just getting started, you need a little spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that if people's self-care plans don't include satisfaction and pleasure, they're missing out on a big part of what a person needs. So that's why I feel like if you can write into that sleep plan, that routine or ritual, things that feel good to you, you're going to want to do them. You're going to look forward to going to bed, and it'll make it a lot easier to set your phone down, to step away from work and enjoy it. It should be pleasurable.
Yeah, I'm thinking of people I know who are, they actually start to rev up with anxiety as sleep time approaches because they have a fear that they're not going to be able to sleep. And it is so beneficial to use this kind of an approach. You lay it out ahead of time. You pay attention to all these various environmental factors. And if you do something like the music or the storytelling, I highlighted one of the chapters where you start talking about words. And I got that gift from my dad, having a facility for language and words. And for me, it's, people used to joke about reading the dictionary. I don't really like to read the dictionary so much as I like to read the books that tell me about the history of the words. You've got a couple here about a doxography. You remember that one?
Mm-hmm. Pretty
writing about simple stuff. Yeah.
Could be the title of my book.
That's what I thought about it. Absolutely. And how do you pronounce the one that is the irresistible desire to squeeze something cute?
Jijil.
Jijil?
Yeah. I think it's a
Tagalog
word. When I wrote
Tagalog?
that chapter, I thought, just wait till I have to read the audio book because I had to learn to pronounce a lot of new words, but that was fun.
Well, that's one of the reasons I like the audiobooks, because when they have these names or these words, I like to get somebody else's idea about how to pronounce them.
Yeah.
And, like you were talking about having the aphantasia where you can't visualize things. I have to try and have a way to pronounce it. Yeah. And it's okay if it's the wrong one, as long as I use it consistently through the book, right? And then we start talking with somebody else who's read the same book and they've got a different pronunciation, and my brain kind of goes for a while until I realize, oh, they're talking about.
Yeah.
So that was one of the chapters that caught me in the beginning. Again, it's a fascinating book because, as you said, it's not about much.
No, there's not much action. It's all about mood, really. Mood and sensory details and a little bit of nostalgia thrown in. That's what I always think of as sort of the recipe for each of these stories. And
I would add relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's an aspect of relationship that I found going through the various stories that, and I want to commend you for the idea that it's relationship without all the trauma.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like connectivity is such an important theme in just human beings and wellness. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted all of this to happen in the same little town, why I put a map in the front. I want you to know that, maybe that the woman who owns the bookshop holds the door at the bakery for the couple that goes to the apple orchard. I feel like a lot of us, especially this year when we're so isolated, are craving that feeling of community and seeing the way that people connect to each other. So that you're right, that's definitely a big part of how I write. And I specifically write when it's a romantic relationship without any gender markers, so that whoever you are, however your life works, whoever you love, you can imagine yourself in the story, populate it with the people who are special to you. that's another part of that inclusivity that was very important to me.
Yeah, and I get so much of the benefit from that conceptualizing small town, in part because I've always enjoyed living in smaller population centers. And yet there's a book titled Tribe where they talk about how when you have crisis, people come together and all of those lines of distinction get blurred, and it's just about all the best of people come out. Not when they're living on top of each other in cities, day-to-day routine, isolated in their boxes, but when a crisis hits. And so a lot of that small town living, my experience has been, it brings people closer together because you don't isolate. When you're walking down the street, you say hello to people because you're going to see them again tomorrow or next week.
Yeah, it's not enough.
Yeah, and it's that small town living. This story just popped into my head. I'll share it. I went out to Northern California for my second job after college, and I was waiting to get a full-time job. So I was substitute teaching at the high school. And I had a junior in high school who didn't think he had to pay attention to anybody and was causing problems well, that was a part-time job I had. Another part-time job I had was round-the-clock healthcare for a grandfather who was in his last few weeks of living. Well, that young man at the high school who thought he didn't have to pay attention to the teacher and I ended up escorting him and somebody else to the principal's office. One morning when I entered the door at Grandpa Marshall's house, here's the junior. I opened the door, it's like, he's looking at his assistant, his substitute teacher that he treated so rudely. And I'm the caretaker for his grandfather. It's a small world. It's a small town. And so, your consequences or your behaviors have consequences. And then how that can blend into connection, because I'm not carrying a grudge from the way he acted in high school, and I'm welcoming him into his grandparents' kitchen. And I got that kind of a flavor as I read your stories.
Yeah, I think that's definitely by design, and something that sometimes I think people feel a nostalgia for, or they're missing out on because they aren't living in places like that, or they aren't feeling connected, or the community that they are seeing every day is just online, where there isn't that kind of accountability for your behavior, or people can often, say and do things that are quite hurtful and then just turn off their computer or phone and walk away from it. So I quite like the idea of this interconnectivity in a community where, it matters.
Well, and I get the sense from it that it holds us in a different way, that we feel in a sense a level of safety, even though there's that accountability. And so sometimes we might have anxiety about how the ripple effects of our behaviors are, but at another level, I think there's a strength and a holding of us in those communities.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel lucky that I live in a neighborhood like that. And, we often are reaching out to each other and catching each other in those moments. Somebody needs help with childcare for the day. Somebody's, running an errand for a grandparent. And does anybody have this or that? And people say, sure, I'll leave it on your porch. I'll be over in 5 minutes. That's just incredible, really, how much we need that kind of fellowship.
And it nurtures us in a different way. Yeah. Yeah, in a way that the electronics simply can't, in a way that the constant plugged into either a news stream or entertainment devices can't.
Yeah, I agree.
So what's, as you recall the book and the different times you've talked about it with people, what's another aspect or a story that you want to talk about from this book?
Well, you know what? I just lost my grandfather about a month ago. And so I will talk about the story that I wrote for him. It's called The Asparagus Patch. And it was a story that I had thought about for a while, but I wasn't quite sure how to write it. And it's a story about when you are not sure if your memory is real or a dream. And I think a lot of us have these experiences from childhood where we sort of remember doing something amazing, but we can't figure out how we would have ever ended up in that scenario. And so it's about the narrator driving out to her grandfather's house to visit him, and she sees some hot air balloons as she comes like sort of down a hill. And where my yoga studio is, there is a hot air balloon placed there. And I've had that experience of turning a corner and suddenly there are 5 or 6 in the air in front of me, which is a really amazing thing. And so she sort of remembers this memory that she realizes must have been a dream. And she goes through a couple of those moments. And she finally gets to her grandfather's house, and they spend some time picking up kindling in the yard, which is something I did with my grandfather a lot. And there's a line that comes straight from my grandfather. He used to have a horse chestnut tree in his yard, and we would pick up the horse chestnuts. And he handed me one day and said, "Put this in your pocket, and an elephant will never step on your foot." And I still have that one that he gave me in my jewelry box. And he was a very optimistic fellow. And it's called the asparagus patch because he died at 96, and he put in a new asparagus patch.
3 years?
Yeah.
It takes 3 years until...
And he was just an optimistic fellow. He was like, "Yeah, let's put one in because I'll want the asparagus." He never...
In 3 years, yeah.
We were just kind of talking a minute ago about that catastrophizing and that what ifing, and that wasn't something that he did. And he had certainly seen a lot. He was a veteran of World War II, and then, raised a family in Flint, Michigan, and had seen a lot in his life, but it didn't take that optimism away from him. So the night that he passed, I went on Instagram and just asked people to read the story. And it was incredibly comforting to me to know that people were reading about him all over the world.
And have your feet stayed safe from elephants?
So far.
Good. That's a great one. I hadn't heard that one before from a grandfather until I read it in your story. And I love the idea that, there's a little illustration of the shoots coming up. And then, he says, yeah, well, and you are asking, or the granddaughter's asking, how long before you can eat those?
Yep, 3 years.
Yeah. Lovely.
Yeah, he was a great man.
And did you say he lived to 96?
96. He would have been 97 a few days ago. It was a hard loss because we couldn't be together. It wasn't safe for us to be together. And so we did a lot of Zooming and things like that. And my mom and dad, it's my mom's dad, who was my last grandparent. My folks live in South Carolina. We're in Michigan. We couldn't come together. It's a difficult time for grieving because those sort of normal processes that we go through, even if they're unpleasant, we don't like them. They do serve this purpose of making you feel like you closed the last pages on his book. And so it's a strange time to be grieving. Obviously, so many people are this year.
I'll send you a link to the talk I gave on the friend who taught me about this used to call it termination. But that was before the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and all of that. And people didn't like that term anyway. So years later, as I was teaching other people about it, they said, "You've got to have a better title." And I said, "Okay, I'll call it saying goodbye to good people without saying goodbye to good memories." And so I gave the talk for years. And I think back in 2015, I finally got a version where I was able to record it. It was in a workshop setting in front of 10 or 15 people. And I'll send you that link so you can take a look at that, what that process would look like. It has an associated PDF file that has 3 pages of categories that I can use for that process to try and stimulate memories and kind of cataloging the relationship and the memories. And might be a little challenging for somebody who's memory challenged, as you were saying, that difficulty with your autobiographical memory, but and then again, this kind of thing might help trigger some of it.
Yeah, that would be great.
And you're right. It's a different time for all of these people who are grieving. One of the best things about a process like this, saying goodbye to good people without saying goodbye to good memories, is that it's not dependent upon the other person being here or reciprocating, right? It's an internal process I do to kind of relive the good, the bad, the not so good, the life lessons, catalog them, lock them in, rehearse them, and through that process, feel all of the negative emotions and demonstrate to myself the fact that it's not too much. And I can face the sadness and the upset, and I don't have to turn away from the memories. I can turn and look at them, and I can welcome them.
Yeah.
And we have several people right now who are going through that. They attend our support groups and things, and
yeah,
it's important to start talking about it and helping people understand that while it would be preferable to be able to be there and hold a hand and hug someone, it isn't a complete negation of the ability to do a grief process or a termination process.
Yeah, that's so true. We're just going to need to do so much of that work in the next few years. I think we've got so many people who are just grieving but are traumatized, and putting people sort of back together after all of this. I think we're going to need a lot of tools like that.
Well, and we talked about trauma the last time we talked, when we were talking about your yoga studio and practice, and how so much of it is, body focused and energies retained in the energy system we call the body. And I like to mention for people, Peter Levin's work, In an Unspoken Voice is one of his newer books that talks about that in great detail. And it's so important to recognize that these things we call traumas, or the upsets that a professional would label trauma, are really discernible. We can really figure them out. And they really are energies that we're either willing to see and let flow through us, or we're not willing to see, and so they stay locked down in us. And you were mentioning, breath techniques and some stretches or poses that are so effective for that.
Yeah, I've been working on kind of going back to basics lately with breathing, because there's lots of fancier techniques, but breathing's available to everybody. It's free. It is our most basic biological function. And a couple just adjustments in the way that we breathe can bring huge benefits to us. We don't hear about it enough, but this is not any disputed science. This is well agreed upon science among those who study breath, and the physical therapists who work with airway problems and things like that, that if you're not breathing through your nose, at least for the inhalation, you're not bringing enough nitric oxide, which lingers in the sinuses and bonds there to the oxygen molecules, into your prefrontal cortex. And this is going to cause problems with focus. You're going to feel more anxious. You're going to be in your fight or flight response more. You're not going to sleep well. It can affect your digestion, the function of basically your entire body. Things like executive function, all that sort of stuff. And so I've been working just on helping my students to remember the basics of breathing through your nose while you're awake, and absolutely while you're asleep. It is truly essential, at least that the inhale goes through the nose. If it can come out through the nose, that's great. But if it needs to come out of the mouth, that's okay too. So I thought we might do a really nice breathing exercise where we're going to breathe in through our nose and out through pursed lips. This is one that I would recommend for vagus nerve stimulation, because the exhale is longer than the inhale. It's 3 times as long. That leads to vagus nerve stimulation. And it also just regulates the nervous system in general. So this is a good one for, I'm feeling anxious, I'm scattered, I'm all over the place. My nervous system is too stimulated. So I'm going to count it out for us. Why don't we do maybe 5 rounds? We're going to go in through the nose for a count of 3. And then when you exhale, you're going to purse your lips like you're breathing through a straw. And sometimes I tell people, carry a straw with you in your bag, and you could actually use a straw. It'll help you exhale more slowly. So let's just take first an inhale and exhale in through the nose and sigh. Breathe in for 1, 2, 3. Purse your lips. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I know that's long. Breathe in. 2, 3. Pursed lips. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Just one more. Breathe in. 2, 3. Pursed lips. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Take a breath in. Sigh. One more time. Breathe in and sigh. Often after I do those, I like to just be still for a moment and notice how my body regulates its breathing. And a lot of times when we're feeling more anxious, we're actually breathing too much. We are hyperventilating. We're breathing in too long and too deeply. We often think about sort of oxygen being the cure-all and carbon dioxide being a bad thing, but your body actually needs a balance of those gases. And most of the time it will regulate itself, but sometimes we become dysregulated because of the world we're living in. And so I find that a really useful practice to restore the balance.
Excellent. Yeah, there are tools for that. The straw is one. There's an actual nice little metal necklace with a tube that's got some Japanese symbols on it that people can buy for carried around their neck. And I have people that just touch it and it reminds them, because if they're in public, they don't want to put the device in their lips. But I've had therapists that have recommended that they're using it for their own personal benefit. And it helps them do what I've been coaching people to do for years. Basically exactly what you just did. Comfortably fill your lungs and then make sure the exhale is 4 to 8 times longer than the inhale. And you don't pressure it out, you just resist it out, and a whole system slows down in response.
Absolutely.
So we should unfortunately wrap this up because I have somebody else coming in 10 or 15 minutes. Projects, are you doing anything online other than, we want to mention again, you have your podcast, which is Nothing Much Happens?
Right. And my book, of course, Nothing Much Happens, is available anywhere. You can buy an autographed copy from nothingmuchhappens.com or go to your local independent place. Of course, Amazon and all those places have it. I do teach yoga several days a week online, Zoom classes through ethos.yoga. And I think I'm going to teach a free class that's just going to be about breathing. I'll probably have that regularly up on my website just because I feel like it's one of those basic things that people need right now. I have some other really exciting therapeutic projects coming out specifically with my content, but until all the contracts are signed, I'm really not supposed to talk about it. So, if you have me back in another 6 months.
Well, I'll do that, and I'll invite you to put me on your list to be notified when those things get published, and then we can schedule another interview. This is delightful. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I recommended it to a few people already, and hopefully more will hear about it through this episode.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks. Take care. Kathryn Nicolai is the owner of Ethos Yoga in Holly, Michigan. She's also the creator of the enormously successful podcast, Nothing Much Happens, and her book, Nothing Much Happens, was published in October 2020. Nicolai is the creator of the enormously successful podcast, Nothing Much Happens. She is an architect of coziness, writing soothing stories that both ease the reader into peaceful sleep and teach the principles of mindfulness, so that waking hours likewise become sweet and serene. She leans on her years of experience as a yoga and meditation teacher to seamlessly blend storytelling with brain training techniques that build better sleep habits over time. She is the owner of Ethos Yoga. She lives in Michigan with her wife and 3 dogs.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.